This is such a promising time. Anyway, there's this book called Paradise Lost, California's Experience, America's Future. And I'm just going to read a little bit from it. Although he doesn't make crude accusations, this is the review of the book, I'm sorry. Schrag plainly believes that the changing attitude of California voters toward government and the changing ethnic composition of the state are related phenomena, okay? That is, that these new attitudes, Proposition 187 against immigration, anti-affirmative things, Initiative 20, Proposition 209, and he puts it starting back in the 70s with the property tax. Remember Proposition 13? That got rid of property tax for public education, that's the beginning of the end for the state of California, basically. And that happened sometime in Proposition 13 happened, I can't remember what date, but it's in like the 70s. And 78. And so from a situation where, which I found very interesting, where minorities as well as poor whites, especially from Oklahoma and the heartland, went to California looking for especially really good public education. That's the reason why my parents went, so that we could get really good public education. From a situation where California had the highest budget for education in the Union, now it has built 20 new prisons since 1984 and will have to build 14 more by 2005, and it leads the country in prison building being the most important line item budget. So I thought that was interesting that he says that the changing ethnic composition of California is compelling these initiatives. And it's something to think about when it comes to the state of Washington. And then there was this other book that is getting this incredible attention, but I just couldn't believe this. And I thought of the Ida B. Wells book, Trouble in Mind, Black Southerners in the Age of Jim Crow. And it's talking about this man who was lynched. And it says, in this particular, this is a book about, why blacks left the South. The white-owned newspapers of the South had long, this is from the reviewer, not the book, have long gorged themselves with exaggerated or fabricated accounts of rape by black men, right? In the paper's version, in terms of the reasons for the death of this man called Sam Hose in Georgia, the fight between Sam Hose and his boss became transformed into the most enraging crime of all, the rape of the white man's wife. White Georgians tracked Hose down and prepared for his lynching. 2,000 people gathered for the killing, some taking a special excursion train from Atlanta for the purpose. The leaders of the lynching stripped Hose, chained him to a tree, stacked wood around him, and soaked everything in kerosene. The mob cut off Hose's ears, fingers, and genitals. They peeled the skin from his face. They watched, a newspaper reported, with unfeigning satisfaction as the man's veins ruptured from the heat and his blood hissed in the flames. They watched, a newspaper of the time, right, reported, with, oh my God, oh Jesus, were the only words Hose could manage. When he finally died, the crowd cut his heart and liver from his body, sharing the pieces among themselves, selling fragments of bone and tissue to those unable to attend. No one wore a disguise, no one was punished. Subsequent investigation showed that Hose had never even entered the White Home, much less committed a rape there. Du Bois, who was a professor at Atlanta University at the time, had prepared a statement about this lynching, and he was going to take it to the newspaper. But then he learned of the lynching and that he would pass a grocery store displaying Hose's knuckles in a jar and turned around. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that just mind-boggling? I don't know if that's more mind-boggling or that we don't learn about it. This was also interesting. Nobody knew about it, right? So it's not covered. And black troops fighting insurgents in the Philippines found leaflets published by Filipinos that told the Americans about the Sam Hose lynching, asking how could they be willing to die for such a country. After the Sam Hose outrage, Du Bois regained his resolve and became even more politically active. And after the brutal riots in North Carolina and Georgia, many in the growing black middle class turned their backs on Booker T. Washington. And even as the Great Migration took many talented and energetic black Southerners to the North, those who remained in the South never ceased their struggle or their accomplishment. So this looks like a very interesting book that has come out. I found it just made my morning yesterday kind of, or Sunday rather, complicated. And then there was one also in the same book review. I couldn't believe 3 books that actually seemed interesting, 3 book reviews that actually seemed interesting rather. Carol Tavers, who is a very good feminist, who has written really wonderful work, including The Mismeasure of Woman. The Mismeasure of Woman. In her review of a book called A Mother's Place, she's talking about this debate that is now coming back about what's the woman's place. Is it in the home? Is it taking care of the kids? And so on. And she says, this endless debate about a mother's place could occur only in a culture that gives mothers no help, provides no universal and reliable system of daycare, and then blames mothers for whatever they do, work if they're middle class, not work if they're on welfare, work too much if they're ambitious, or work too little if they aren't ambitious enough. So I thought that was interesting, and she, in her review of this book called A Mother's Place, taking the debate about working mothers beyond guilt and blame, she talks about how the death of this baby, Matthew Eapen, how it was transformed, and I'm sure that race was the subtext to its transformation, to being not about Louise Woodward, but about the mother who left the baby in Louise Woodward's care. That it wasn't, that in the newspapers, the American media as well as the British media transformed the process of who was guilty. Not the young woman who killed the baby, but rather the mother who wanted to work. Right? So I think that that's all. I thought of all of those in terms of this, the issues that we're going to be talking about in terms of this place and positionality that Carol Boyce Davis talks about. And I thought you might like to know the latest in our famous Thomas Jefferson debate, which is going high tech. Did the founding father have an affair and children with Sally Hemings, a slave on his Monticello estate? Now there might be finally real clues to argue about, because genetic specialists at Oxford University in England are comparing the DNA of Jefferson family descendants with those who trace their ancestry to Hemings. So that's, I know, it just continues on and on forever and ever. And then it has all these great, issues about the opinions of Joseph Ellis, who of course does not even want to think that, here's Joseph Ellis, who wrote this book, American Sphinx, the Character of Thomas Jefferson. Okay, that's, quote, this is Ellis. Not because they say he was a gentleman, and gentlemen do not do that sort of thing, but based on 6 years of studying Jefferson, I believe his deepest sensual urges were directed at buildings rather than women. I said, oh boy, where this stuff goes is amazing. Anyway. And I recommend everyone reading. I don't have time to do it, but as we're looking at the whole question of the body this week with the film Naked Acts, which comes tomorrow, there's a fairly good article in the New York Times called Empire, Nature, and a Good Look at the Male Body by one of the few black women regulars at the New York Times, and where she definitely looks at this whole constructing of Africa as, and these are her words, I thought this was great, because Boyce Davis has another way of doing the dark continent as a white boy toy. That's how she describes Tarzan movies, the dark continent as a white boy toy. That's how, and it's coming back. So these movies, it's amazing. Gone with the Wind and Tarzan, they are with us forever. We cannot ever supersede them. They last forever and ever and ever. So she gives a really good analysis in here about, she says, as for equal opportunity beefcake, you can get brief glimpses of handsome black bodies in a number of the old films from Weissmuller on, but they are quickly disguised or disfigured by outlandish costumes and brutish or servile poses. And there was another really good film article I recommend you read, Hollywood Sex and a Sad Estrangement, where they're talking about how the increasing political influence of right-wing Christian organizations has made Hollywood increasingly squeamish about sex, so that even though with the women's movement in the 70s and certain interrogations about the body, about films and so on, that what in fact is happening is that this infantile model of sexuality and television and Hollywood films is returning, the kind of 1950s stuff, only masked in the romance of children, like that. What's his name, DiCaprio? Every 13-year-old that I know, or anyone from 9 to 14 is like into Leonardo DiCaprio. And so that these kind of DiCaprio wannabes, I'm sure those of you who have children know who he is. It's amazing. So I thought of that as a way of sort of beginning the whole question of how we interrogate some of the issues around this conjunction that we have this week, which is the interrogation of the body and the body image, how that affects black women, then how Carol Boyce Davis is trying to, she's taking us outside the United States, and she's pushing these boundaries in very interesting ways, saying that black feminists thought once it's limited, once it's constrained or defined within the context of United States, then you fit into empire. You don't And that constrains then the interrogation. And then that past that is not past, whether it's Thomas Jefferson, whether it's Gone with the Wind, whether it's lynching, how it comes back, but yet is denied, as we read in the paper about, like today's Times, has something about people who would choose to go on workfare or welfare in order to not have a job. Who on earth would do that? And they have, clearly those experts do not consult with people who are on welfare, who, struggling. And even though you might find the isolated person, most people would rather have jobs that are going someplace, that have career options. Before I get started, I'm gonna have to take the commute is long, so I'll have to excuse myself in a minute. But last year in Harper's magazine, there was an interesting questionnaire given to African American women by the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, which is one of the most famous in the country, right? It's where you go when you think you're going to recover from cancer. If there's a chance, that's one of the 5 places in the country you think about. Okay, as a part of a breast cancer study being conducted by that center, participants in the study were asked to respond to several surveys. And the cultural survey below was criticized for being racially offensive and irrelevant to breast cancer research. And as we think about, remember the point that Davies makes about the whole issue of women and their health care? What does all of these complicated positionings of black women, how does that affect the kind of health care they get? Here's this questionnaire that is really reassuring to most black women about their health care. Okay. You were supposed to ask, whether they totally agree, totally disagree, sort of agree, or strongly disagree with the statements below. Here they are. I feel more comfortable around blacks than around whites. I know how to play bid whist. I listen to black radio stations. In other words, agree, strongly disagree. Okay. I read or used to read Essence magazine. I try to watch all black shows on TV. The person I admire the most is black. When I pass a black stranger on the street, I always say hello or nod to him or her. Deep in their hearts, most white people are racists. IQ tests purposely discriminate against black people. There are many types of blood, such as high, low, thin, and bad blood. I was taught that you shouldn't take a bath and then go outside. I believe that some people know how to use voodoo. Some old black women know how to cure disease. If doctors can't cure you, you should try going to a root doctor or to your minister. When I was young, I was a member of a black church. The biggest insult is an insult to your mother. I went to mostly black schools. Dancing was an important part of my childhood. I usually add salt to my food to make it taste better. I save grease from cooking to use it again later. I eat chitlins once in a while. What was that measuring? And while you think about that, I'm going to take a short trip and I shall be back. What was that measuring? For a breast cancer study, okay?
All right, thanks.
This son made there.
One that's tighter.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, is that mean that out?
Yes, sir.
You think they'll actually get past 19 this year? Yeah. They are in the second half? Oh, okay, so now who are they gonna play? Like, I haven't been paying attention at all.
Yeah, that's who they're playing, I believe.
They're playing it? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we can.
I wonder if I can make it against the Bulls.
No way.
That would be pretty exciting if they meet the Bulls. Huh? It'll be the Knicks? Or, oh, so the next year.
Bulls are better. Yeah, Bulls are better.
Is that guy still playing for the Knicks? Never mind.
Okay, where's my little...
No.
So, this particular article, which was deemed to be racially offensive and irrelevant by a lot in this black newspaper, when people pass this around to each other, and I got a copy of it, it's only from last year, it started an interesting discussion of, well, you know, what are the hidden ways in which you know that being black has consequences, but then that really scare you. And one of them is this whole issue of the relationship between healthcare delivery services and the attitudes that people have about black women. And that has often, and this exemplifies this, but I mean, so that the point that Carol Boyce Davies mentions about, she just throws it out there that this is a whole other book, the impact of being a the relationship between being a black woman and then the impact on the health care is just extraordinary. And and in thinking of that most definitely relates to the whole question of, then how do people conceptualize even something like childhood? Who's a child? Who's not a child? When does childhood end? What kinds of likely behaviors are people engaging in when they go to a doctor and they get those surveys? Out of my own experience, I can tell you, I remember having to, I once had a job where I had coverage for everything, but I was leaving this job. So I thought, well, let me go have a motor overhaul before I leave this job, because I'm not going to have health care coverage like this very often. And so I decided to have my veins stripped. My dad had just had his stripped. And I really didn't need these veins stripped, but I did have a kind of a complicated, you know, jutting out in one leg of one of these veins. And so I just thought, let me get it stripped while it will be free, right?
What does that mean? I'm sorry.
Vein stripping, it's it's this vein that's right here, right? And they cut here. Then they're supposed to make 3 incisions. One here at the groin, one at the knee, and one at the ankle, and pull out that vein.
Why? Don't you need it?
Huh? I shouldn't have had it done, but I had it done. And when I woke up, I had on one leg like a railroad track going up and down the leg. You know what I mean? I mean, instead of 3, I had this whole thing going up one leg.
Are they varicose veins?
Like varicose veins, right? That if they stick out a lot, that sometimes you will have them stripped.
So you didn't need them though? You didn't need those veins?
Well, I mean, I think because I had that done so young, I recovered in a way that I hope I recovered, you know? But I am the type now that I don't think even if they ever told me I had cancer, I'd have an operation. I mean, I have such feelings about the healthcare delivery system. I don't think I'd ever go under the knife again. You know, I mean, I can't imagine it. But the thing that really upset me was not just that the way I woke up and found my leg, but that the only questions this man asked me, this doctor who was doing it, who was supposed to be an expert on healthcare, was about my sexual activity. And I was trying to figure out how that related, you know, and it's the same when you're real young, you don't want to say, excuse me, sir, but I just want my veins stripped. How does that relate? You know, you feel very kind of, especially when the women's movement was just beginning, you know, you go this, oh, you know, awa tagu siam business before doctors, right, in the healthcare industry. And you don't even challenge them. Of course, that's totally different. And doctors don't like it when you challenge them. And so when a couple of years ago, when I told a doctor at Group Health that her job was to help me manage my body, she was highly offended. And she introduced herself to me as, hi, Angela, I'm Dr. Jackson. And I said to her, Joe, do you want me to call you Joe, or are you going to call me Dr. Gilliam? And we had, her name was Joe Jackson. We had an ongoing battle, and because I respected her expertise, I tried to reach out to her and explain that, you know, the civil rights movement had all those little old ladies and men marching on that Selma Bridge just for the right to be called Mr. And that this was a big deal in my family, that you weren't a boy, that you were Mr., or that you were Miss or Mrs., and that you were not, you know, this hierarchy, right? Of this, and that especially in my mother's, that was a big deal with my mother. She couldn't understand it. I am the expert here, and so I just said, well, I appreciate your expertise. Your job is to help me manage my body, and that was just, you know, for this doctor, it was just too much. But I recommend you trying this, because if you don't, then you have to make people think that you will really call them to account. Then, but these are just these little private wars that black women, and other women too, but it's especially acute for black women, and I'm sorry that Boyce Davies does not go into it in more detail and more depth, but it's especially acute, that whole business of black women and the positioning that you have to do, the negotiations that you make in order to just go through something like trying to get decent health care. So this whole question that I think that Carol Boyce Davies is her book, I think, is best constructed within the transformation of the world's economy, and then how she is trying to show how the issues that are germane to black women also relate to other women. Certainly this question of, that we've mentioned, that I'm going to talk about more today, of patronage, working class and poor women around the world. And basically third world women, as she describes it, but it's not just third world women. One of the books I just ordered is a book about what is happening to women in Eastern Europe. Eastern European women have lost their rights, and so we're going to just sort of go over some of the issues that are affecting women around the world, and as a way of accompanying this sojourn that Carol Boyce Davies is starting us on, in terms of broadening this context within which black feminists or black feminist theory is being positioned. Okay. I think I'm gonna sit. She constructs this whole thing about theory and who does theory, and I think that that's important because almost any black professional is trained to be what I call a native manager of other natives. And she builds on the discussion really nicely that we started last week about Leith Mullings's work, you know, whether that was anthropological theory or not, what is theory, and Boyce Davies actually defines it. But I think also what I would say in terms of the division of the world between so-called primitive peoples, who are today called third world people, and the civilized or developed countries or industrialized countries or wealthy countries. These euphemisms are the 20th and 21st century, but they really mean these old 19th century terms, primitive and civilized, right? And, and in many ways, I think that what has happened to Eastern Europe in my view, it's because Marxist theory, and especially as advanced by the Soviets, never really became universalized, so that, let's say, third world people, that is the primitives, never saw them. I'm being facetious. When I do this, these are quotes, right? That's what I mean. I'm being sarcastic here. The primitives, that is today's third world people, who have this relationship, they're third world because they've got that organic colonial relationship to the so-called first world. The first people's business is only here in Evergreen, right? Everybody else thinks of first world as Europe, the United States, wealthier people, and of course it stems from that old meaning of civilized. But the notion of stages of development, and I'm going to have to use the board for you to see this. See, this whole notion of that all of life is somehow on some kind of evolutionary path, ending at a spot that is somehow associated with Europe, and that you're either primitive or civilized based on, in the 19th century, that is developed or underdeveloped, based on your proximity in terms of either acquisitions or material goods or attitudes that resemble Europe. I mean, this trapped the Soviets. This trapped the Soviets, because then the Africans and other third world people felt that, you know, to say that we're primitive doesn't, and they even using quotes around it. One colleague from Papua New Guinea said, even putting quotes around primitive still marks the word. It still marks the concept. It still consolidates the concept. So, let me start over here so that I don't block you. You see? So here's primitive over here, right? And this is Africa, Asia, Latin America, so on and so forth. And of course, in the last 50 years after World War II, this has been transformed a lot. But when for example, let me give you an example how this was used by Soviets. Because I have a lot of respect for the then Soviets or the former Soviet Union, because it was the only country that ever really gave serious money and guns to any African country for decolonization. Let's be clear. Let's be clear, okay? That if we're talking about decolonization and independence movements, the support by the Soviet Union was critical. The problem was the concept of the primitive, and then how that meant they functioned, not just with other countries, but outside their own countries, right? And not within their own countries. So I met this engineer. I went to this conference in Mexico, and I met this woman who said she was from Siberia. And she was European looking. I said, Siberia? Oh, I'm really interested in all of the peoples of Siberia, the Chukchi, the Goldie. And I had seen that Japanese movie that I recommend everybody seeing, that's just a masterpiece, called Der Su Uzala, which is a classic by Akira Kurosawa, and I had about a Siberian hunter, and it's an interesting juxtaposition about the primitive versus the civilized, the primitive versus the civilized. And so I thought it had helped me to think, you know, who defines civilization, who defines primitive? And Chukchi and Goldie peoples, who are hunting peoples, who are kin to the Inuit, some people call Eskimo, but you know, it's up in the northern regions. Then I said, oh, I've often been interested in the Chukchi and the Goldie, you know, ever since I saw this film. And she says, the Chukchi, the Goldie, but those are primitive peoples, you know. So when she said this, you know, it was like, I'm sure you're not connecting me to these people, are you? I'm an engineer, and she, you know, she talked about her life and so on and so forth. And I later had a very interesting argument with the head of Soviet ethnography at another conference, and this time it was in India. And I insisted on talking to him, what is this with this primitive stuff? And how, you know, who decides moving forward? Which way is moving forward? And how do these people feel about that definition? Well, what is going on in Eastern Europe today, not just in Eastern Europe, but all over the former Soviet Union, you can see that people didn't sort of like it too much, because there are all these ethnic battles that are emerging. The good part of the Soviet Union that has been lost, that is really germane to our discussion today, are these benefits for workers. That a country that would define itself, or an empire, if you will, that would define itself as being worker-centered, also included women. Okay. And women had the right not only to work, but to have certain kinds of positions. That is like gone the way of the Ipana toothpaste, which disappeared a long time ago. But, okay, it is just gone. And what that means, which is very interesting, is that it is transforming social relations all over the globe. Western feminists, including American feminists, are not talking about what the change in Eastern Europe means for women in terms of the rights of women there and how that's affecting all kinds of places. Not the least of which is Cuba, where the desire by Italians and Germans for dark women is returning. Okay, so this whole, remember I think I mentioned before that you have Eastern European all over, Eastern European women all over Western Europe. The loss of these women's rights has had very serious effect. So that the question of, I think that to sum up, part of the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed was in effect because third world peoples like Africans, certain black people, there was a conflict over how this construction of the primitive was made. And in all of the glory and ballyhoo about the fall of the East German Wall, the Berlin Wall, that is never discussed as part of the reasons why more people in the world did not support this worker-centered focus. So with the demise of that wall, then, if you just say, I'm interested in workers' rights today, oh, that's old, that's dead, that's gone. That fell with the Berlin Wall. Now everybody wants to be rich. Everyone wants to go along with privatization. Everyone wants money. Greed is good, as that man said, what's his name, Michael Douglas in Wall Street. Greed is good. And so that the concept of workers' rights fell with the Soviet Union. Now I want to make that really clear. It fell. with the Soviet Union. The concept of a society in which workers' rights take precedence, are primary, fell with the Soviet Union. Not in Russia, not over there someplace in Slovakia, but in the United States, in Brazil, in Africa, everywhere. That is a part of what globalization of the economy means. That now, a notion of economics that means basically that capitalism and a kind of privatized, deregulated capitalism, the one where your banks merge so fast and the fees rise, and before you know it, you're paying. Remember the telephone? My favorite is a telephone company, and how affordable a phone used to be, and now how difficult it is because of this ever merger. You know, are they really frightening? So there's no opposite theoretical positionality, to use Boyce Davies' words, to that fact. Okay, so that's point number one. In short, it's hard to feel, when we've talked about it a little bit in here, this nobility of those whose hands go in the soil or who clean up after people and otherwise do labor that others don't do. The nobility of it is lost because we're also asking people to go back to a condition of mere slavery, where you work and do certain kinds of money without the benefits, without some kind of guaranteed income, without health care. That's what I mean by benefits, right? So this issue that Boyce Davies mentions, for example, about nationalism being really masculinization. I mean, it's very interesting. How do you really define then nationalism? You know, these kind of ethnic loyalties that are emerging all over the world. And she says that nationalism is really masculinization, and of course we've mentioned this before, but we've only talked about it in relationship to black nationalism. Here she says nationalism, period, is masculinization. In other words, a return to a kind of patriarchy that is very focused on one's own group, quote unquote. So that the concept of international solidarity and principles and support for workers is also the opposite of this nationalism. Internationalism versus national. Okay? Okay, so given that, what does this mean for women? Let's go really fast. I'm going to go really fast through this whole question of...
Wait, does that make it feminine international support for workers in solidarity?
That's a good question, Noah. No, not necessarily. But it's just like war is configured as, she uses these terms, you know, like penetration. I mean, have you ever looked at discourse of war? You know, like missiles and, you know, like, well, if we penetrate the enemy's line, you know, it's really sexualized. And especially during the Gulf War, it was really obvious that there's some interesting conceptual connection between war and violence and patriarchy. But I'm not saying, Noah, that as some feminists do, that, well then, women who don't use that language are therefore, or who eschew that language, then therefore they're more peaceful, they have more solidarity with the poor, they're more for workers' rights, they're more for peace, and so on and so forth. I still think that that is class-based. And I'm thinking globally as class-based. But some feminists maintain that the language this language of quote-unquote penetration, even the very construction of guns and the weaponry is somehow linked to maleness. I don't think it's linked to maleness. I think it's linked to a system of patriarchy that has its economic connections to capitalism. Although, I don't know of any socialist country that managed to really theoretically put this out on the table quite that way. So it's an interesting. Okay, so the transformation of the world economy is now bringing new challenges to women. On the one hand, the rights that were taken for granted in these former socialist countries have been eroded with the emergence now of only one pole, meaning it's not a two-polar world anymore, right? There's just no one in opposition to the pole that represents the wealthy center that is being constructed in the United States. The South, or this, sometimes it's called North versus South. The South, or the Third World, is also in the United States, right? So that it's important to realize that within industrialized countries, there is also this unequal development, unequal exchange, and that this so-called South exists in this country as well. Okay, so that the major media in the Western countries don't often challenge this narrative that links the rising inequality of the world with a reinvestment in patriarchy. I'm going to explain this in a minute. So when a patriarchal analysis is used to encapsulate the effects of capitalism, it is done so it reproduces the position that the expansion of capitalism is an improvement over what went before. For example, this was in a newspaper article in the Times. The liberty that began here in the days, this is a quote, of Mikhail Gorbachev has led to a very visible erotic culture. Look at this. You see that linkage? Let me read it again. The liberty that began here in the days of Gorbachev and Glasnost, meaning the Soviet Union, has led to a very visible erotic culture. In other words, now that there are all these kind of, there's Playboy in the Soviet Union and all that stuff, that is seen as freedom, not the loss of job possibilities for women. You see what I'm saying? Okay, that's what I mean by this, when a patriarchal analysis is used to talk about the effects of capitalism in the world, it's used to signify something that's an improvement over what went before. That's what and that's what I mean by that.
That article I brought up about mistresses being a sign of a good economy.
Right.
I forgot it, and I was going to bring it in. I can go copy it.
Okay, because that's so important, Jen. That's really, I mean, that point that Jen made last week, I was thinking about also. How when you put those two together, that a good economy, the sign of a mistress is a sign of a good economy, and how that happens. Just look at what that's entailing to make that conjunction. Okay. Moreover, this new global economy increasingly relies on the import of female labor. Now, who do you think, for example, not just the import of female labor, let's look at Indonesia. Indonesia's in the news today, yesterday, and whatever. And Indonesia pulls in not just from the villages in Indonesia, but from other countries around it, for people to go work in that Nike, especially the Nike factory. The Nike factory doesn't have men working there on the assembly line. That is the women are the ones doing those sneakers. And also there's a Nike factory in Vietnam that once the women, like Chi, there was this Indonesian woman who came last year to the Seattle region who had been fired from her Nike job for her activism. And once people like Chi start to articulate their rights as workers, well then what did Nike do? Nike also went to Vietnam, but Nike also pressured the international banking institutions to bail out, Suharto and the other, and the lead ruling class of Indonesia to keep, controls over those workers in the Nike factory, okay? So it's really important to see that women are often that privatization and these policies of privatization and deregulation are like this planned economic strangulation that we mentioned before. And in the former socialist countries of Eastern Europe, then again, here comes this business about the emergence of liberty. For example, let me give you an example. When I was teaching in Portugal, when Portugal had a fascist government throughout most of this century, but then in the 70s it had what they called a carnation revolution. And one of my students once told me, one of my Portuguese students was, you want to know what fascism is? What it does to a people? You could put a suitcase down on a corner and no one would come up to it and touch it, ever. Whereas that wouldn't happen. Now, I thought that was an interesting definition of fascism. I would give you another definition. I would tell all my students, there were around 50, you can start your papers any way you want to. I want your analyses. And all 50 of the papers, the first page, were identical. That was, for me, a definition of what fascism does to a culture. See what I mean? They were all identical, all 50. I couldn't believe it. All of these papers, they couldn't, and I kept saying over and over and over again, no, I want your ideas, that didn't, they were still caught up in this whole concept of, of really being constrained in terms of what individually they could do. At about the time that I was teaching there, though, right after this flower revolution, you start to see coming in of all kinds of pornography. And if you wanted to sell something, no matter what it was, all you had to do was to say, banned before the flower revolution. It didn't matter what it was, how trashy, how whatever. It meant it was post-fascist. It was therefore good. It was therefore free. It was something we couldn't have before, therefore it's an improvement. So that's kind of the way in which what you have happening with the rise of pornography in certain countries that didn't have it before, especially in Eastern Europe. Here's what one feminist says about pornography. Pornography's boom is also alleged to be a healthy example of the operation of market forces, namely of consumer-led demand. Pornography, that is, utilizing women's bodies as an object for consumption on the one hand, and on the other, in the sanctity of marriage and motherhood, and on the other, in the sanctity of marriage and motherhood as the reincarnation of a patriarchal model of gender relations. Okay, you want me to read that again? Pornography's boom is also alleged to be a healthy example of the operation of market forces, namely of consumer-led demand. Pornography, that is, utilizing women's bodies as an object for consumption on the one hand, and on the other, in the sanctity of marriage and motherhood as the reincarnation of a patriarchal model of gender relations. And I think we are living right here in this country, this reinvestment in a kind of very rigid patriarchal model. Even China's transformations are frequently described as inevitable byproducts of modernization which will ultimately improve the lives of people. Here's the New York Times on China. Quote, "The economic explosion has boosted prostitution and sexually transmitted diseases." See how there's a kind of an innocence connected to that because of the joining of the economic explosion. Like, that's really wonderful. It has boosted prostitution and sexually transmitted diseases. Okay, even though she's not a black feminist, I've often been interested in following the career of Anita Hill, and I think I mentioned how she talked about what happened to her in Washington in '91 when she came for that, or '90 when she came for that hearing. And one of the things that she said in her first lecture that she gave afterwards was that she didn't have patronage when she went to Washington. And I think that that we have to see the rising inequalities at the global level as the loss of women's patronage. Women don't have patronage. That is, they don't have institutional support for traveling anymore, so that they are losing their rights to work, and to travel for women to look for work is extremely dangerous. Without this cultural capital. And remember when, I mean, those of you who had me before know that I've always talked about this woman from Thailand named Malika Vajiratan, who talks about the language of trade and exchange, and that if women don't speak the language of trade and exchange, men will end up speaking for them, number one, and number two, they'll end up in really complicated situations they can't sometimes get out of. And that is most definitely what is happening, not just to Eastern European women who find themselves now in Western Europe looking for work, but who, but also other women in Southeast Asia or wherever trying to travel. And travel is very tricky. Yesterday, I had an encounter that I'm going to write Alaska Airlines about. As I'm going to my speech, needless to say, I'm only going for, I have a briefcase, I'm in a suit, you know, that all-purpose professional woman's garb on, and I was the only black person on this plane. And this woman wouldn't bring me water. She was bringing around juice, and I said, "Is there any water?" She would, and they kept promising to bring me water. And as the plane starts heading towards Spokane, I finally get up to go get the water myself. The woman who's the first class cabin stewardess, her name is Sandy. I saw that because we're writing that airline today. She gives me the water and then follows me down the aisle. And as I take my glass like this, getting in, she hits my elbow and all the water spills on my suit. And I'm thinking, patronage. You know, and I look around, people see it, these men see it, and it's like they have seen nothing. You know, and I'm saying, oh my God, you know, you can't, you know, it's just really amazing, this stuff that is happening. And I think it happens more to women, but I'm sure that men find, especially men who are not quote unquote elite or whatever, they find it happening to them also. And the rules that our country has adopted about who gets to come into the United States really point this out. You gotta have $1,000 in the bank. I mean, God, would you be able to go someplace if they asked that? I mean, I couldn't. $1,000 in your, you know, in the bank. You have to have mail speak for you and say you're coming back, etc., etc. Okay. Listen to what this German, I mean, some of the German theorists have been doing really good work on this question. maybe because it's a real issue being so close to Czechoslovakia. And Czechoslovakia is one of the countries that is sending out a lot of women. So much so that this pamphlet called Hot International Sex, if you want to go to a sex shop in Seattle and you ask for, can I have hot international sex? And to look and see what languages, Czech is one of the languages that you can get this hot international sex in. In other words, hot, I see I have to explain this. Coco Fusco, who, everyone saw Guillermo Gomez Peña, right, when he came earlier this year, you didn't see him? In any event, his former partner was Coco Fusco, who is a performance artist, but she's also written really good cultural criticism. And we had her to campus in our course called Global Webs. And she told me about doing a performance piece in a Long Island mall where she asked men and women, where do you want to go for sex more than any place else in the world? And that men and women said they would like to go to Brazil. And she and I were talking about what that means to Brazilians, that the entire world wants to, or certainly from wealthy countries, wants to go there looking for sex. What does it do to a country? And she told me that I should get this book, go to a sex shop and ask for hot international sex. So I thought I'd do that. Boy, was that fun. So I go, you know, with my glasses, so that I look really teacher-fied. Can I get this? Do you have hot international sex? And of course, everyone in the store turns around to look. And all my glasses and as props did nothing. It was still no place did I get, but I did get it someplace on Capitol Hill in a gay and lesbian shop. I did get one of the ones that I was looking for, and it has all these things that you can ask for. You know, like, do you do this, or how much is that, or whatever, in all these different languages. Okay, and Czech is there. And so I decided to call up the guy who did hot international sex. And once I convinced him that I was doing research and no, I was not the police or the FBI or Interpol, whatever, he told me about, you know, well, he tried to validate what he was doing, but one of the things that he said that was very interesting was that there's one Autobahn, one highway, one strip between Czechoslovakia and Germany, where women just line the streets from Czechoslovakia, and German men go looking for these women. And I've mentioned the whole thing about the Minister of Health and Tourism and how she feels that, you know, in Germany, this whole question about German men going overseas. And I'll come back to that. So this is the reason why the German men going overseas, 70% when they go alone, go for sex. And it's a real health issue for German people. So this is the reason why so many German women in her ministry do so many really good theoretical pieces. And I'm going to read something from one of the books that the Ministry of Health and Tourism sent me from Germany, that one of the students from Austria translated for me. In accordance with the international dependency structures, women are traded between the first and the third worlds, where the first world controls the demand for women of the third world. International power structures thus express themselves through the bodies of women. And this, of course, came to a head in Beijing, these kinds of issues, because Beijing was in Asia, and because this whole question of the strength of Asian women also in providing really good theory. They were there with their brochures, and I'm going to read now from the Foundation for Women that was which is an organization in Bangkok, Thailand. And this is what they say. Traffic in women is an integral part of international migration and is a global problem. Investigation should be made in connection with the International Division of Labor and labor export-import policies of sending and receiving countries. That is, certain countries send, certain receive women, right? Donor, receiving countries. And the impact that they have on national and international migration of women. Traffic in women is a contemporary form of slavery and a gross violation of women's basic human rights. And even more acute is the reality of child prostitution and how the international community is attempting to organize around it. And in the United States, there's really a good organization out of New York called ECPAT, which is Ending Child Prostitution and something traffic and sex tourism, something like that. And what really gets complicated for a place like Brazil is when you intersect race with this, so that little girls of 12 who are black are not little girls. So, and I think I mentioned the project that I have with my daughter, where I'm going to take that look at the debate in Congress over the sex trade, rather over lowering the consensual age. With my daughter's work with prostituted girls about the same age, and we're going to juxtapose those two discourses, why they're in the trade, how they got there, and so on, with what people say is the reason that they should reduce the age to 12 of consensual sex. Fortunately, it lost, but oh God. So, the transformation of the global economy has thus fostered the commodification of women and children as they become increasingly identified as representing a growth industry, replete with advertising campaigns that transcend borders and boundaries and the entrepreneurial characteristics of an organized industrial sector. And I think, and I want to talk about Brazil, because Brazil is a real problematic place, which is almost like South Africa, but with more race mixture. And this whole business about the mixed race woman who is seen as very interesting to your older European or people from wealthy countries. This is really driving an enormous growth of a mafia in Brazil, all through the northeastern part of that's quite dangerous. But as the motive force for economic growth becomes centered around market-centered drive, then it is if there's no what I would call moral attachment, or ethical. Because moral is such a dirty word, the way the right wing uses it. But if there is no ethical requirement to the market-centered drives from wealthy countries, then logic has it that this industry is going to grow, and it is growing by leaps and bounds. Okay, it's just, there are millions of children, for example, in Brazil that are street children, and little girl children find it very hard to avoid being prostituted. And I prefer the word prostituted. That's kind of, it takes it away from them, as it puts the agency for this fact on others, on a system, and takes it away from the children. This is what one feminist says about all of these foreign men coming, looking for carnival, looking for, these sensual, dark women. It is as though the foreign man today valenites the colonizer of yesteryear and vice versa. Both are swayed by the charms, sweets, and shaking hips of the mulatta. I didn't like that sentence, but it was the closest thing that anything had that even acknowledged that there is a relationship between the historical assault of so-called discovery and the colonial plantation system, and the role of the foreign man coming back to not just to Brazil but Cuba, as we'll see in a moment. And I think there's also another aspect that is growing with the globalization of the economy, and that is the consolidation of a generalized global Afrophobia at the level of international elites. An Afrophobia at the level of international elites. This is it's not only feminists who are aware of this. One of the most exciting, some of the most exciting work that I've seen is from a graduate student from the University of Bahia in the Northeast, who's a man, and who is using actually his identity as a man, but he's black, so he probably doesn't have too much of that identity, to sort of tap into the tourist products that are being crafted by the government. And that's his dissertation, is how the government is sponsoring this. Okay. And this is from his work. Official and private agencies in the northeastern part of Brazil were responsible for the sale of numerous travel packages and for the utilization of images of regional women as tourist products in pamphlets, videos, magazines, and other forms of advertising distributed in the principal targeted countries like Italy, Germany, Switzerland, the United States, and Argentina, right? At the side of this arsenal of information is this Ashe music. Oh, God. She uses Ashe, okay? And she defines Ashe, but Ashe is like one of those words that it's sort of like, well, Ashe music specifically means this return to the young people of this region in the northeastern part of Brazil to kind of rupture the racist narrative that has historically been commodified in Brazil. They are kind of reinventing in Africa. Now, some blacks, Brazilian blacks, call this Afro-Disney. I interviewed someone who said that this reinvented black culture is really ultimately also for another kind of tourist. That's her critique, and she refers to this as so much Afro-Disney. But Ashe music is this, has anyone ever heard of Olodum? Paul, what's his name? Paul, Simon. Paul Simon recorded with Olodum, in the Rhythm of the Saints, something like that album has Olodum on it, and they are a part of this Ashe music revival. The merchandising of black culture as a symbol of Bahia and the stereotypes constructed around the sexuality of both black women and men all contribute to feed a growing market, that of sexual tourism, and with specific products such as the jumbo is like caramel, jumbo-colored brunette, for example. Here's another feminist looking at this unequal exchange between who gets to define what's exotic. Okay, the role of the exotic. That is, there's no equality between visitors and the place they travel to as tourists. And that is one of the points raised by this writer, Carol Boyce Davies. Here's Deborah Root. One of the persistent tropes or traps, I hate that word trope, and I always just say trap for it. It's one of those postmodern phrases, but it means really trap. One of the persistent traps of exoticism is the fascination with the erotic possibilities of the colony. which in effect becomes the eroticizing of racial power. Exotic images of women have to do with colonial fantasies of power and the sexual availability of women classified as exotic is for the most part dependent on the ability of the colonist to coerce, that is, to militarily and economically control the colony.
Repeat that.
Okay. One of the persistent traps of exoticism is the fascination with the erotic possibilities of the colony, which in effect becomes the eroticization of racial power. Exotic images of women have to do with colonial fantasies of power and the sexual availability of women classified as exotic is for the most part dependent on the ability of the colonist to coerce, force, that is, to militarily and economically control the colony. You see that? I see question marks. Amy?
That's just long, but I think I got more the second time.
Okay. In other words, this, you know, well, I don't want to go into your discussion this afternoon, but, you know, okay, so let's take the Caribbean. Look at the travel section in the New York Times or the Seattle Times. Do they advertise Trinidad as a place where workers are striking? You know, do you ever hear about Grenada, you know, the home of Audre Lorde's relatives, as a place of where there was a new jewel movement to try to change the relationship between tourists and Grenada? No. You hear about it as in terms of its beaches, its water, its palm trees, and client-friendly natives.
But that's not unique to third world, though, isn't it? Isn't that like what all countries say about themselves when they advertise? That all countries pump up their things.
What countries do that?
Any
No, that's it. No, give me an example.
one. I just think that any ad I've seen is always like any country's
From what
always
country?
put up. From Europe, from Great Britain to Jamaica, has always put up a front of what the rich tourists want to see, not the economic and social struggles that would go on in that country.
Right, but there is no subtext that pliant, interesting people go along with any British package. That's not what they are. They don't market that.
That's true.
They market the seat of civilization and where you come to see where it all began.
That's true.
They don't market their women,
That's true.
right? They don't.
Their heritage and their history.
Their heritage, their
But they
history.
leave out the brutalization of their colonies. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
Exactly.
Ireland and Scotland and Wales would have some objections to being touted as the seat of civilization since they got overrun by the Brits.
Mhm. And not just them. I mean,
Oh yeah, everybody,
half of Africa, half the Caribbean.
half the world.
So, or as the black British people who were there that Boyce Davies talked with, their slogan, "We are here because you were there," you know, so.
Huh?
The black British people have this slogan, "We are here in Britain because you were there in our country." But only, they don't say in our country, but that's what's implied. Okay. Brazil, okay, so let me move to, let me move along because I want to leave at least 10 or 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes for a discussion. Also, it's very interesting the role of something like Playboy being put into the Portuguese language. And for example, when I was doing my field work in Brazil, there were hardly any porn magazines. And today you see a lot of not just porn magazines, but some that are obviously were done for non-Brazilians, and those that were done for Brazilians are different. And I think the whole issue about the, which I mentioned before, the structural eroticizing of inequality, and how the linkage to witches, you know, Malleus Maleficarum, you know, how do you detect a witch? And how one of the characteristics is that, well, you can tell because if you feel erotic feelings about a woman, then that person is a witch. That was one of the things, the warnings in that book. And it's a part of the discourse in Brazil that, and in many of these, in the Caribbean and lots of places, that men can't help themselves. It is the women who do this to them. And this is a part of a Christian thing that's been going on forever. The Federation of Cuban Women see the return of prostitution in Cuba as being exclusively based on the search for material products. But they don't want to talk about it. And as Coco Fusco, who went to Cuba to study this very issue, the woman I said who did that performance piece in the mall, she says, and in one of her things that she did for Ms. Magazine, that mulattas, or mixed race black women with black ancestry, are once again the focus of sexual exploitation and sexual mythology as they were before the revolution, before the Cuban Revolution. So you see this aspect of what is happening in Cuba is, of course, related to what is happening in what happened in Eastern Europe, not just because they were linked geopolitically and economically, that is, as a global alliance, but in effect because everyone is now concerned that these current trends of privatization of the global economy and the sexualization of the search for meaningful labor, that it is tied to the contemporary stage of the advancement of capitalism and there's no way out. That people often feel that there's no way out. So I think that these locations that women are being thrust into, these new locations, these new boundaries and borders that they're expected to cross in terms of the whole aspect of the sex trade. And I want to say that little boys are also subject to this, and this is not something that is exclusively gendered, that is just female. And throughout North Africa and throughout Thailand, for example, little boys, as well as here, there were people from this country marauding Tijuana for little 12-year-olds. It came out in the newspaper, 12-year-old boys. And I often wonder, you know, what would happen if the Man-Boy Love Association was full of black men? You know, would anybody be able to even say such a thing, use those words?
What is that?
The Man-Boy Love Association is some organization based on in the Northeast, in the eastern part of the United States, that basically says that there should be no age limit for consensual sex, and it's an organization promoted by mostly older men who believe in having sexual relations with young boys, and it's called the NAMBLA, North American Man-Boy Love Association. And
That's a big thing.
That's a real thing, yes indeed. Go look at it on the net.
It's a really popular organization.
Now, looking at the history that you're dealing with this week with Southern horrors and all this business about black men and sex, just imagine, if you will, that somehow that black people were involved in this. And could this trade grow by such silenced leaps and bounds if in fact third world men were actively pushing it, and it were not one of these manifestations of the échange inégal, the unequal economic exchange between first and third world countries. I doubt it. Anyway, questions? You want me to repeat? Any quote? Oh, here's another one of these German quotes. I forgot to. Internationally organized prostitution depends on a pernicious combination of third world poverty, first world economic development policies. This is Germany now. Laws that permit international trafficking and indentured servitude, and worldwide patriarchal cultural norms that encourage male sexual prerogatives. More and more women are discussing the global politics of prostitution, the direct links between developmental policies pushed by the World Bank and the IMF, and the experiences of 14 and 15-year-old village girls in such countries as Brazil. But why aren't we talking about that in this country when we talk about the expansion of capitalism or of feminism and the new tasks of international feminism? It's just not on the agenda. Question? Comment?
I was trying to get a grasp of the sense of urgency or desperation or something in Brazil as compared to like New Orleans that I've been to, and a lot of that goes on there too, especially with young boys. I was wondering if you.
Oh, really? In New Orleans?
I was wondering, like, is it less exposed there, or is it not? Is it more obvious in certain places in Brazil, or like why? Is it too close to home in New Orleans and other like sort of?
See, I think that we live this kind of culture of denial about a lot of things. And I'm sure people know about it who live there, but because it's never spoken about in any public arena, then nobody knows about it in Washington unless you've been to New Orleans or you've somehow managed to see this or witness it. And I dare say there's a lot of aspects of the sex trade right here in many parts of the country, into, kidnapping of kids and all of that sort of thing. But even black women writers who address, the problems of, the issues of, let's say, the problem of living in the United States and how that constrains the definitions of, let's say, what feminism is or what black feminism is. I just think that it's really hard to rupture or to challenge or to interrogate what is silenced, because a lot of times you don't find out about it. I mean, unless you go on the net, you don't know about it. Now, I confess, I'm really very net ignorant. I'm internet challenged. Not forever, but up to this point. So I don't usually, I use the net very rarely to go in and tap into, what is there. And I think some of the points that you're raising are very much available on the net. But I don't know anybody who's done any work about New Orleans. I mean, I think that would be really important work, because I'll bet it's not just boys, but that the whole sexual tourism ethos, especially around Carnival and Mardi Gras, probably exists there, just the way it does in Brazil around Carnival. It's the same period, you know, it's the same holiday. And so, I mean, that would be important work for somebody to do. When I was in Bangkok, I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was in one of these hotels that had a little brochure, and, and this brochure said, "What's doing in Bangkok this week?" And right there it was, you know, if you want to look for girls that are young, da 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 da, and if your taste runs to boys, I'll never forget that. If your taste runs to boys. It was like one of those brochures that you would have in any hotel. It wasn't some kind of porn magazine. In Bangkok. And of course that basing culture, you know, the basing culture of rest and recreation, I mean, our society bears a lot of responsibility for that ethos being spread around the world. And the only place I know that has been protected from it is Guam. And there, because the women, they just drew one of these phalanxes around the young girls in Guam, the Chamorro women, elders, that was impenetrable. And I've often, when I heard this woman talking about this, I often wondered what was different. There was still a base there, but you just, you know, it was like, no, not this. You can be here, we can't do anything about it, but not this. It's a very interesting story, the women of Guam. So, I don't know. But I know that it's a growing problem. Question? Is it depressing? Yes, of course it's depressing.
I think it's interesting the point that Noah brought up, and that if we were, I mean, it seems like you could draw like a million interesting comparisons between the ways that different countries are portrayed through tourism and like trying our soul to potential tourists. And I guess like women is one aspect. Like I can't picture what a Greek woman looks like, but maybe I have a stereotypical picture in my mind of what a woman from the Caribbean looks like, because I've seen it in every like New York Times travel section I've ever read or something like that. But you could also maybe look at the way a country is portrayed in terms of land. Like when we saw a really interesting movie about Brazil, I think earlier this year, and it was about Rio, and it was like no one was living there. It was like this,
It was like a park, right?
beautiful forest, like beautiful trees. Like, I don't know if they were trying to sell going back in time or like getting back to nature. There were no people to be seen. And then if you contrast like that, or like beautiful oceans, beaches, with like how maybe people involved in the tourism industry would sell like Greece or Italy or England, and you think of architecture and you think of art and museums and stuff. And so there's definitely like different things going on with how Europe is sold as maybe portrayed with how most of the rest of the world is sold to tourists.
Or even between like the north and the south of this country, it seems like that in the north it's very much kind of, you know, the bosom of freedom and liberty and democracy, and you know, you can go visit the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, and you can go walk the Freedom Trail in Massachusetts, and then in the south, you know, it's the land, and there's never anyone there, and it's very kind of, and I was thinking too, because I was thinking about maybe when you asked that now, like how like Florida markets itself in terms of tropicalness and stuff like that, and like the difference between like exoticism and kind of the Disney marketing. I haven't seen Florida do a lot of stuff, but Virginia uses a lot of like, Virginia is for lovers and like a lot of sunset like stuff and shows a lot of beaches. I was thinking a lot about that. I mean, that's a commercial I saw all the time when I was back in New York.
Really?
Oh man, I saw that and like.
I'm from Virginia, so I didn't see any Virginia commercials.
Yeah, Virginia's definitely marketed as like southern, like the land is really beautiful. The commercials for it, like I'm from Virginia too, like always astounds me. And I also just think about the whole beach marketing thing, that like you can't, I mean, you just can't see any marketing stuff for beaches, whether it's like a commercial or a postcard, or you can't see anything that doesn't have a picture of a woman's body, you know, like in a bikini or whatever. So definitely in the United States, you get that too.
I mean, I think that because it's such a silence theme, and because it's raised in this week's reading by Boyce Davis in such a, I mean, in such a rich way, in a sense, very complex way, the whole issue of, you know, what it really is what are some of the problems of conceptualizing of women throughout the world, especially the third world. This is one of the amazing ways, and I like how she uses so many writers. And what we'll be coming back to this whole business about the, you know, especially the diaspora and black women writers. When we look at the week when the African, we have the African woman writer, the two African women writers is our major theme. We'll be coming back to that. But it's really, you know, looking at our society and different parts of our society and how they inform what's going on in other parts of the world is also really problematic too, troubling. Any other question? Oh, come on.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Cuba, just because I know that all these, like when I was there, a lot of people that I stayed with an older couple. They were in their 60s, and they were one of the man of the couple was talking about how he had fought with Che in the revolution, and he was really patriotic, and they were talking about how there was no sex industry in Cuba, and that it had ended with the revolution. And then, you know, going out and I mean, I know that I was sort of ushered to the different people who were going to give me a certain perspective on Cuba, and then when I would go out on the street and just talk to like regular people who weren't like appointed to talk to me, I got different versions of what was going on in Cuba. And there's definitely like a huge tourist industry that's getting bigger, and that the sex trade is part of that, and that the United States has, I mean, I guess the culture of tourism that the United States perpetuates like affects that, but then at the same time the fact that they have to turn to tourism is caused by the economic sanctions put on by the United States, and I was just sort of wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
That's a really good point, Erica. The last time I was in Cuba, which was in '88, the Federation of Cuban Women had a contest called "If It Weren't for the Revolution," Si No Fuera por la Revolución. And they let me read all the entries to this and see the winning entry. And the winning entry, I said, oh, you've got to make this into a movie. It is so important, because they did eliminate prostitution in Cuba. But the winning entry was a story. It starts with this family in this town, small town, sitting around a table, discussing should they enter this contest. Si no fuera por la revolución. So the mother entered the contest. And the mother, it was just so amazing that, you know, she She had been prostituted as a teenager, as a child. She thought she was going to work as a maid in Havana when some guy came to her parents' village to get her. And she was taken to a brothel. And she had been in this brothel for 5 years. And one day in 1958, it is or something, some guy is shot. She sees someone, you know, huddling who has got a bullet wound. And she takes him to the brothel. And this house of prostitution, and he stays there in convalescence. They get the bullet out and so forth, and they become friends when while he's convalescing, and he keeps saying, "Comes the revolution, you know, you don't have to do this anymore, comes the revolution." And she says, "But it's too late for me. You know, I've been a whore for 5 years. It's too late for me." And he said, "You'll see, it's not." Anyway, around a year later, after Fidel and the Sierra Maestra take whatever, he goes back and he gets her, right, this woman, and he takes her to Pinal del Rio, which is this small town. And the story is of this couple talking to their children who are now almost grown. Should we enter this contest because it's going to eliminate the privacy that we've had of anonymity in this story? And they decided to enter that story anyway, and it won. And I mean, it makes me really emotional because I interviewed the last time I was there all these women, especially black women, who were like around my age, who said, 25 years of my life I lived, or half of my life I lived under capitalism and half under socialism. And the difference in my life for me as a black woman, you can't imagine. You know? And Cuba is really important because people, again, this denial, people try to pretend that it's not a black country. So that comment by Assata Shakur is really interesting, that she's from the last free slave place in the Western Hemisphere. And I don't know if you know what's happening to Assata Shakur, but Governor Christine Todd Whitman has put a bounty on her head of $100,000 to anybody who brings her back to the United States. Because, you know, she got on NBC when the Pope was there. She wrote a letter to the Pope saying, this is what, you know, that this isn't true, what happened to me, and so forth and so on. So then NBC goes down there, does this program, which they distorted, but which nonetheless, all of the police departments and everybody in the government of the state government just got really upset. They had a newspaper article about this just this last week. How, you know, yet another reason to not ever get rid of the trade embargo against Cuba and da-da-da-da. And, you know, Assata Shakur is a black woman who ended up in Cuba and who was able to raise a child there. You know, sort of, I mean, I just feel that, in a sense, the return of prostitution is the beginning of the return of that old Cuba. And it's just really tragic. And speaking of which, people say, all kinds of people tell you that racism is rising in Cuba. So it never goes by itself. You know, it's always these complicated intersections. So that in order to get these tourists that really don't want to be around black people, you know. One of my favorite things that I think I mentioned that Audre Lorde wrote was when she went for Essence, when she went to a Caribbean island. It wasn't where her family was from, which was Grenada. When she went to Antigua, and someone told her she couldn't come in because of the way her hair looked, and her hair was not the correct way. It's not the way a proper woman looks, and we don't want women who are not proper in our country. So, just really interesting. these values and how, you know, what comes with tourism. When you have a pliant population that is delighted to serve, what does that mean? You know, delighted to see tourists and can I clean something? Can I this? Can I that? So, you know, even though it's really complicated, I'm glad about a place like Jamaica where nobody wants to go to Kingston because nobody's happy to see anybody foreign. You know, so, and everyone knows it. So on one hand, you say, great, but on the other hand, you know, it means that your life is also imperiled, but no one is delighted to see anybody touristy in Kingston. And maybe that's, you know, that's a solution. You know, to be known as some place where it's really dangerous for tourists, I don't know. But I do know what happens to a country once you decide that your major source of foreign exchange credits is the tourist industry. And how it affects women in particular. So I think that that kind of positions a lot of what Carol Boyce Davies is raising in her question of migrations. And we'll come back to this issue of black women's writing in the diaspora when we read Oyewumi.